Hello and welcome to the lecture for Module 11. This is your lecture for the week. You already know that we are not having a Zoom lecture today. So this is the only lecture you'll receive. We're going to cover chapters 8 and 9 today, and that's also going to be covered in your reading. You have quite a reading assignment this week, but you'll be very glad to see that you don't have a lot else to do, just a lot of textbook reading, this video lecture, and a project. And the project is actually an escape for you from our formal essay requirements. So I think you'll probably appreciate that. Go ahead and get started. We'll talk briefly about the history of victims' rights. And you probably remember earlier in the semester, we talked about that up until the 17th century, the victim was the person the crime impacted directly. What we've called this semester the primary victim. And sometimes the victim back in the olden days would include a family member of the primary victim. And this went on all the way up into the late 1700s. From the late 1700s through today, in the United States, crimes are technically committed against the community as a whole, or against society, that's one way to say it, and crimes are committed against the government. We all know the government is represented by the district attorney. For example, in New York State, there's a district attorney in every county. In other states, they call them different things, but there's prosecutors in every state, usually at the county level. And district attorneys are really important people, as are their assistant district attorneys. Because remember, we talked about this earlier in the semester, really important to remember this for your final exam. District attorneys have the sole authority. They are the only people who get to decide if an offender is brought to trial, who will testify at the trial, what evidence they will try to submit as evidence in the trial, if an offender is given a plea deal or an opportunity to plead guilty or plead to lesser charges, and if criminal charges are dropped altogether and the offender gets to walk free. All of those decisions are made by the district attorney. So really powerful position to be in the criminal justice system. And remember, we've talked a few times now about how victims were largely forgotten. They weren't really given any role in the criminal justice system pretty much after the late 1700s up until the 1970s. Because remember, this is that philosophy that the crime is committed against the community and against the government. The actual victim, the primary victim, kind of got shoved into the back seat. When you start chapter 8, you're going to read about 3 social movements that had a significant impact on victims' rights. Remember, the civil rights movement really came to the forefront in the 1960s. You're going to read about how the civil rights movement impacted victims' rights. The law and order movement, which you may not have heard of, and the women's movement that came shortly after the civil rights movement. All 3 of these social movements had a huge impact on the way we looked at victims and their role in the criminal justice system. So when you're reading this information in the textbook, make sure you note, and I mean note on paper, actually write it down just so you remember, specifically how these movements led to more advocacy for victims. There's a section in your textbook in Chapter 8 called Academia. It's really about research, right? A lot of our research is done in our academic institutions, especially our larger research universities. And there was some research performed related to crime victims in the 1940s and 50s. But you can imagine that research conducted in the 40s and 50s was highly biased, right? You can imagine what it said about women, about people of color, that today we know not to be true at all. The first serious, really important academic research on crime victims began in the 1970s. You're going to hear 1970s a lot in this lecture. I want you to remember the first serious research on crime victims began in the 1970s. And here's a pop quiz question for you. Do you remember the year that marked the first time someone used the word victimology? I'm not going to tell you the answer, but you better remember it. There's a section in the text in Chapter 8 about the Victim's Bill of Rights. This is a document that kind of mimics a little bit the Bill of Rights in our U.S. Constitution. And it's a statement of what victims should be entitled to, how victims should be treated. Some states, note that, some states have actually put this in their criminal laws, their criminal statutes. Other states have added it to their state constitution. Of course, most states have their own constitution in addition to the federal constitution. But it's important to remember it is not the law in every state. Important to remember that. The Bill of Rights includes the right to be treated with fairness, respect, and dignity, the right for crime victims to receive timely and accurate information, the right to be present at all criminal justice proceedings. That would include not just the trial, but the arraignment and pretrial hearings and every other phase of the trial process, and the right to restitution. This is just an example of a few of them. You'll see the full list in the textbook on page 231. I think it's on 231. Another time we're going to talk about the 1970s. The 1970s marked the first time many victims or their family members, usually in the case of homicides, their family members started groups that help and advocate for victims. These are largely grassroots efforts. These are not something largely funded by the government. They're almost all nonprofits. They were almost all founded by someone who was directly impacted or were secondary victims to a crime. So these are moms and dads and uncles and brothers and sisters and wives and husbands who start these groups almost exclusively. You're going to read about many of them in the textbook. Some of them you've probably heard about. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence was one of our first big advocacy groups about intimate partner violence. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we talked about them in an earlier module, really important organization. Parents of Murdered Children, this is a really powerful group. Their title is self-explanatory. And Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MADD is their acronym, MADD. We're going to talk about them again in just a minute. All of these victim organizations have very helpful and informative websites. So if you ever want to learn about any of these groups, just search by name, plop their name in a Google search, and they all have really good websites. Now we're going to change gears a little bit and talk about federal laws for victim. We're now entering Chapter 9. This chapter is pretty heavy. It's going to take you some time to get through it. You need to read all of it. It can be a little dry, but it just lists by time period chronologically, act after act after act that was passed to help victims. So while you're reading it, and it is overwhelming, I'm going to give you a couple I'd like you to focus on in the next few slides. And while you're reading that information, it's going to be helpful to you remember certain things if you think about what was going on at that time. So if you're reading about federal laws in the 1970s, you know this is the origin of victims' rights, of the recognition of victims' rights, just after the civil rights movement, the law and order movement, and the women's movement that we talked about earlier. In the 1980s, I want you to think about what was going on in the 1980s as opposed to the 1990s. Of course, the 1990s, we know from last week, was the creation of the internet. That obviously created crimes that to date no one had ever heard of to the 1990s, crimes that were impossible to commit until the invention of the internet. So you'll see how some of those acts are specifically related to things that are changing in society. And then it'll finish up with some things from the 2000s. So you do need to read that entire chapter, okay? But I'm going to give you some of the acts I want you to focus on, okay? Hint, these are the ones I'm going to test you on, okay? But I can test you on anything in that chapter. So to help frame this when you start reading it, federal laws, remember, apply to every state. So if they pass a federal law about crime victims, that applies in every state in the U.S. And generally, these federal laws fall into one or more of these three categories. And the three categories are financial assistance for victims. This could either come in the form of grants, where they just give money to a victim. The victim doesn't have to pay it back. It's not a loan. The organization or the law requires that money just be given to victims in the form of grants. These laws can also affect courts ordering an offender to pay restitution. We'll touch on restitution again in just a minute. The second category is victims' rights. What we were talking about just a second ago about victims having a right to obtain information, victims being allowed to be present at every part of the criminal justice proceeding. This is an example of victim impact statements. I'm sure you know what those are. When after an offender has been convicted, the victim or the victim's family members are given an opportunity to just speak and just speak from the heart. And they can be very powerful if you've ever seen one live or on television, where a family member gets to look at that offender and tell him or her how that crime impacted their life. So being allowed to make a victim impact statement would come out of category 2. And the third category is services and benefits, often to specific victims. So it may be federal money being made available to victims of child abuse or neglect, crimes that specifically target women, or crimes that specifically target sexual assault, or crimes that are specifically related to the internet or identity theft. It could be directed toward any specific group. So those are your 3 categories most federal laws fall into: financial assistance for victims, victims' rights, or services and benefits to specific victims. So let's start back in those 1970s. I told you I was going to keep just hitting on the 1970s, didn't I? First federal law for victims was passed in 1974. I would like you to remember that the very first federal law for victims was passed in 1974, and you need to know what that act was. It's the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. Everyone calls it CAPTA, C-A-P-T-A, Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, enacted by the federal government in 1974. This act has a ton of provisions, way too many for me to try to cram into a slide, but just know that it is a very broad law that requires all sorts of actions for and on the behalf of victims of child abuse and neglect. This law is still in effect. It's amended every few years. I have to deal with it frequently at my job, learning the new provisions that have been added to CAPTA. They keep adding more assistance, protection, and advocacy for child abuse and neglect victims. So CAPTA, the very first federal law for victims, passed in 1974. It stands for the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. Also in the 1970s, a really important thing came out of here: the victim compensation boards, and the concept that it's not just enough to rely on restitution, and we'll talk about why. So in the 1970s, 22 states created victim compensation boards, and these boards were created to provide money and other assistance to crime victims. And they provide quite a bit of assistance, but the most important thing they provide is money. And now every state has some form of a victim compensation board. So it's fair to ask, well, why does the state need to give victims money if the court can order the offender to pay the victim restitution? And that's all restitution is, right? It's money the court requires an offender to pay to the victim. But here's the problem. What if the offender doesn't have any money? What if it's unlikely the offender will ever have any money to provide to the victim? Well, it's not fair that they just lose out because their offender happened to not have any financial resources. So these victim compensation boards were created for 2 reasons. One is so a victim of a crime can still receive money, good financial assistance, even when their offender doesn't have any money. That's the first reason. The second is a lot of crime victims never get to identify their offender, right? We know very few crimes of all those committed are actually ever brought to trial. And the only way you can get restitution is if your case goes to trial. So if you don't know who your offender was, if you can't identify your offender, if you can identify your offender, but they're never caught, they're never arrested, or the district attorney drops all the charges against them, you still are going to need financial assistance. So victim compensation boards are very important for those two reasons, because oftentimes offenders have no money to pay a victim, even if they're court ordered to do so, and because the offender may never be identified, might never be caught, or all the charges against them may be dropped, and then the court can't do anything about it. An example is the New York State Office of Victim Services. There are county-level agencies that offer help to victims. Very few of them provide money, actual cash assistance to victims. For that, you have to go to the state level, and for us, that's the New York State Office of Victim Services. Let's move on to the 1980s. One of the most recognizable advocacy groups and laws that came out of the 1980s was Mothers Against Drunk Driving, otherwise known as MADD. They were an extremely influential group. If you ever want to start an advocacy group for anything you're interested in, this is a good one to study. This was, as you can imagine, a group of mothers who had loved ones die as a result of a drunk driving accident. Very influential, very powerful group. Their advocacy and their hunting down legislators and forcing them to change laws changed DWI laws in every state in the country. Every state in the country was impacted by MADD's advocacy for change in laws, and all of those changes involved tougher penalties and tougher sanctions for getting caught drunk driving. Of course, as time progressed, they also had to start addressing driving under the influence of any type of drug, right? They're one of the groups that expressed some concerns about the legalization of marijuana because unlike alcohol, we don't have a really good test when you pull somebody over and think they may have been smoking marijuana, for example, right? Let's talk about this next week. Look like weed's legal in New York, huh? Oh, we're going to have to talk about that. Also in the 1980s, it was very important is the Missing Children's Act. There's just a very short section about that in the textbook. And the Victim and Witness Protection Act. So there's three very important ones from the 1980s. Moving on to the 1990s, I bet you've probably heard of this act. I bet you've seen paperwork or emails around the college about the Clery Act. Jeannie Clery was 19 years old. She was a student at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania when she was raped and murdered in her dorm room on the college campus in 1986. That's a photo of her on the slide. After her murder, her parents were very upset when they found out that students really have no access to information about crimes that are committed on campus. There's no easy way when you're looking at a college or university that you're thinking about attending to figure out maybe how safe am I going to be on campus? How many crimes occur on this campus and what types of crime occur on this campus? So her parents, to honor her memory after her death, advocated at the federal level to create the Clery Act, which was passed in 1990. And this act requires all colleges and universities that receive federal funds, which is darn near every single college and university, very few exceptions, to publish annual reports with detailed statistics about crimes that have occurred on campus. If you look up pretty much any college or university in the United States on their website, and in the search bar you put in Clery Act, it's going to pop out with a report. They are required by federal law to put out that information, and the feds dictate exactly what they have to disclose. So if you look at any campus, the report looks pretty much the same. They have to cover the same crimes. For example, a school can't say, oh, we had 10 larcenies, so we'll put that down. That doesn't fly. It's most serious crimes. So any college campus they are required to publish that information, not just hang it up like in the back of the school cafeteria. It has to be online. It has to be easily available to both parents and potential students. So Hudson Valley publishes their report. If you put it in the search bar on our college website, the Clery Act report will come up because they're required to do it. That's how you lose millions of dollars in federal money if you don't do it. But if you look at the chart, it's almost all zeros. Some years, it's all zeros. none of the crimes have been committed on campus at Hudson Valley. Well, why is that? I'm going to give you a second to think about that. One of the reasons is because Hudson Valley is a commuter campus, right? We don't have dorms on campus. We don't have sororities. We don't have fraternities. We don't have residence halls. A lot of these crimes occur because students are living on campus and have access to each other 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, including at midnight, 3 o'clock in the morning. So that's one reason, is because Hudson Valley is a commuter college, and most of these crimes occur on campuses where students live full time. The other reason is the report only requires information about really serious crimes, murders, sexual assaults, robberies, those sorts of very serious crimes. Schools don't have to report how many students got their book bag stolen, right? That's not really relevant for what we're talking about. So it's really serious crimes. So again, on a college campus like Hudson Valley, where students are really quickly in and out, every student comes, take their class, they might go to the library, and then they leave. In a year of a pandemic, when almost every single student has been home, you can be assured this year's report is going to have a lot of zeros on it, right? They're not going to have anything to report. But if you look at the Clery Act report for SUNY Albany, all you'd have to do is go on their website, put Clery Act in, and look at 2019, 2018, you will see that they have reported all the incidents of all those serious crimes on campus. You don't get information about who it happened to, right? You don't get information about the day of the week or the time of day. They give you some details, but really it's just an accounting. There were 6 sexual assaults. There was 1 homicide, okay? Another really important one from the 1990s that we have all heard about is the federal government enacted the National Child Sex Abuse Registry Act. The really important element of this act is it required every state in the country to give the feds information about sex offenders. Why is it so important? It's so everyone can access it, right? Somebody in California can get information about sex offenders in Florida, and a person in Ohio can get information about sex offenders in Missouri, right? It's a searchable database that the government can use, academics can use, and people like, you and I can use to see where these sex offenders are and what types of crimes they've committed. That led to pretty much every state creating its own sex offender registry. So in our state, the New York State Department of Criminal Justice Services, DCJS, operates the New York State Sex Offender Registry. Now, our sex offender registry publishes data on sex offenders who victimized adults and children. So it's not just about victims who are children, it's about any sex offender who victimized an adult or a child. And one of the main criteria for being published on here is they have to be designated risk level 2 or 3. Very minor sex crimes that have occurred, not that they're minor to the victim, but in their designation in the law, very minor offenses such as a touching, right? A sexual touching. Someone comes up, for example, and grabs your butt. That is a sex offense, right? No one's allowed to touch your butt without your permission. But that person convicted of that crime is not going to be on the sex offender database. That'd be a level 1 offense. So if it's designated a risk level 2 or 3, then they are required to be on the registry. If you've never looked at it, you really should. It's very interesting, and you get very detailed information. You get the make and model of every car that's registered to this person. You get their license plate. If they're working, you get their employer's address. You get where they're living. You can find out exactly what crime they committed, the type of victim, whether it was a child, their age, whether the victim was a stranger to them or was someone they knew, how long they were sentenced to, how much time they served. It is very detailed. Another important feature of the New York State Sex Offender Registry is that you can search it by name. You can go in and search by somebody's name. You can search by county, or you could search by zip code. That's very important. If you want to know if there's any registered sex offenders in your neighborhood, you can simply go in and put in your zip code. Now, if you live in a zip code that covers a huge part of Albany or Troy, obviously you're going to get quite a few, and they're not all necessarily going to be within blocks of you. If you live in a smaller neighborhood with a unique zip code, it'll be people who really are in your immediate vicinity. 2000s, really important act here. You all have heard of it, even if you don't know the name. The official name of it is the PROTECT, all caps, PROTECT Act of 2003. And the main element of this act is it created the National Amber Alert System. We're all used to seeing Amber Alerts in New York State, but this is actually a national program which quickly notifies the public that a child has been abducted. That is its most common use, but it can also be used if a vulnerable adult is missing. And by vulnerable adult, I would mean, for example, an elderly woman with dementia wanders out of her residential care home. No one can find her. The facility knows she is not able to care for herself, especially where we live in such harsh, cold climate, and they can issue an Amber Alert. For example, the one you see on this highway here is that a child abduction has occurred. The police are looking for a blue Honda Civic, and it gives you their California license plate number. If you're out driving and you see it, you call 911 and you can report it. The number of people, of children and adults who've been saved through this program is extraordinary. It's an incredibly successful program, and a lot of people's lives have been saved because of it. A lot of people think it's named Amber because it's named after a kid maybe who died whose name was Amber, and that's not what it stands for. It stands for America's Missing Broadcast Emergency Response. It's actually about amber lights. Okay, that's the color of the light is amber that you see in that sign. So it's America's Missing Broadcast Emergency Response, AMBER, Amber. Okay, that's the Amber Emergency Alert System. In New York State, many of you may be signed up for it. You can sign up with this program to get Amber Alerts. They'll come right across your phone. So no matter where you are, if an Amber Alert goes out, you can know about it. And if there's any information you can offer, it'll tell you exactly who's looking for this person. Another act in the 2000s, it's important. It's actually related to where we were last week, right? It's an awkward name, though. Identity Theft Enhanced and Restitution Act. I really don't think the grammar is right on that, but nobody asked me. So the Identity Theft Enhanced and Restitution Act. This act gives courts the authority to award restitution to identity theft victims. It's not always easy to tell the financial loss of a victim. So this law is really important, and it says that courts have the authority to award restitution, which means make the offender pay the victim, first for money lost. So if they literally reached through your computer and scammed money out of you or stole money from your account, you can get that actual amount back. But more importantly is the second thing they added, which is these victims can also get restitution for the time and money they had to spend to clear their names. Because if someone reaches through your computer and takes $1,000 of your money, you've lost $1,000. But that's only the beginning, right? You've got to deal with your credit. Your credit is going to get so fouled up if someone steals your identity and starts opening fake accounts and starts stealing stuff using your name and social security number. It causes trouble that can last for years. So the government decided victims can also be given restitution for that because it is going to take them years to get their electronic lives straightened back out. I mean, imagine going, you've worked hard all your life and saved your money and paid your bills on time, and you go to buy a house and the bank goes, dude, you have like the worst credit rating in history, and we're not giving you a loan. You're not buying a house. And then you find out someone's been using your name and social security number. It will take you years to get it sorted out. So really important act that allows victims to get restitution for the money they lost, the actual amount of money, plus for everything it took them to try to clear their name. Really important one, relatively new law. Okay, that's the end of our lecture. So here's what you've got for Module 11 assignments. It's a very different kind of week. First, you need to watch the video lecture. Done. You've already done that. One assignment done. The second is to read chapters 8 and 9. You'll see when you open the module, I gave you what I called the textbook alert, right? You haven't had one of those textbook alert, which explains you do have 2 chapters this week. Chapter 8's easy peasy. You'll get through that pretty quickly. Chapter 9, it's deep, right? Start it early. Do not put off reading Chapter 9. Just get right into it. Take good notes and focus on the acts and the state laws that we covered in this lecture, okay? But you have to read the whole chapter. Give yourself plenty of time to get through it. And you have a project. And I promised you're getting a break from the formal writing assignment. Woohoo! So this is an opportunity to be creative. You're going to get to use your creativity, a little bit of imagination, and you're going to demonstrate some of the knowledge that you've gained this semester. However, this isn't free writing. You don't get to write a poem or anything. There's still requirements, okay? Even though it's not our formal requirements, you don't have to use an outside source. No APA citations. I know you're loving this already. There are still requirements, okay? Please note that there are still requirements for this assignment. So please read the instructions carefully. As usual, Project 6 is due on Sunday night by 11:59 p.m. as usual. This week, you have no quiz. There are no articles, and there are no videos to watch, except this one, and you already did it. So I really appreciate your patience. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions at all this week, please send me an email. Take care, and we'll talk soon.